Welcome, everyone. So glad that you could join this event today. I am Tammy Alexander. I'm Director of National Advocacy and Program for Mennonite Central Committee U.S., and I am going to talk a bit about faith-based advocacy on climate change. I'm going to try to keep this to about 35 minutes and then leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So if you think of questions while I'm going along, though, please feel free to type them in the chat, and then I'll review that at the beginning of the Q&A time. So without further ado, here we go. All right, so I'm going to start by talking about why does MCC care about climate change? And I'm hoping that by engaging with this question, I can help us think through how we talk about climate change with friends and relatives and policymakers as well, because sometimes it's best to start with why should we care about this issue? And at MCC, it's a pretty easy one for us because we sources, reduced income in a lot of cases. And so these things all lead to food insecurity. They can, contribute to the need for people to migrate to find employment. And so we're just seeing all the different ways that climate change is affecting the work that MCC is doing and relief, development, and peace around the world. And this is a quote from one of our partners in Haiti, Jean-Remy Azor, who says, "Rain doesn't fall in the way it used to. It used to be regular. There would be 6 rainy years and then 6 dry years, but that doesn't happen anymore. This has affected agricultural production and has made it increasingly difficult for small farmers to make a living and have food to eat." So in MCC, we also take very seriously the responsibility to listen to and to try to amplify the voices of our partners who are talking about climate change. We did this in 2018 with what we called our Global Voices Tour. We brought 3 individuals, MCC staff and partners, to the U.S. From El Salvador, Nepal, and Zimbabwe to talk about how climate change was affecting the communities that they live in. And this was through our partnership with the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions. And so we were able to, they went to a lot of churches and some university settings, but we were also able to bring them to Capitol Hill to talk with policymakers so they could also hear these stories firsthand about how people were being affected by climate change right now. And it's not something far off in the future, but people are being affected in very significant ways today. So a common thread that we heard with all 3 of those participants was water. And we hear this a lot, that there's too little water to grow crops, too much water at the wrong times. This is a quote from Durga Sanchuri in Nepal. 800 million South Asian people depend on water from the Himalayas. And he went on to talk about how as temperatures are warming and the ice on the mountain recedes, that it's causing droughts and just a lot of reduced water flow. And that's combining to threaten rural farmers and also their tourist industry. And then he told some stories about an apple farmer whose trees no longer bear fruit, about women in one village who are now having to walk 2 hours a day for water because their water line dried up. And then also talked about how the lack of water is really hampering the rebuilding following a 2015 earthquake because you need water to make cement. And so that was really slowing down their ability to get people back into homes. And then this is a quote from Dr. Sibo Nkube in Zimbabwe, or not a quote, sorry, it was a story she was relating about how climate change contributed to the cholera epidemic in the capital city of Harare, and describing, it wasn't just climate change, but climate change was a contributing factor because farmers were finding, because of a drought, that they couldn't farm, and so they were migrating to the city to find jobs, and that put stress on an already strained septic infrastructure. And so that led to eventually to contributing to the cholera epidemic that they had there. So we hear these stories and we know that the data backs it up. This is a couple of years old now. There's data on temperatures where it lists the 5 warmest years on record there. But if we were to put 2020 in that mix, as you probably know, that would be number 1. And if we put 2019 in there, that would be number 3. So, still continuing this obvious warming trend. And then up there on the right-hand side, there's some information about the number of people per year who are internally displaced. So that's often rural farmers who move to cities, displaced by climate change. And so They estimated it was about 26 million a year in the range around 2015, but by 2050, they're predicting it will be 143 million people a year displaced by climate change. And you might know that the United States is no longer the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. China now has that distinction, and we are number 2. But if you look at emissions over time, cumulative CO2 emissions, which were what caused climate change, the US is still the clear winner by far. And the rest of the world down there at the bottom, I mean, there's 10 countries here at the top, and then all of the rest of the world barely edges out the US there. So you can just see the huge responsibility that the US has for causing climate change. And then we're still doing it, because if you look at the metric tons of CO2 emitted per capita, so per person per year in 2017 was about 16 metric tons. The global average is less than 5. And then the goal that we should be at for a sustainable world to really mitigate the worst effects of climate change would be about 3. So the US, all of us individually, are far exceeding the consumption that we need to really curb climate change. And then I mentioned how climate change is often one of many factors contributing to things like conflict or disease or displacement. And this is a graphic from our Safe Home, Safe Refuge campaign last year, and it illustrated how climate change is driving migration from Central America to the US. And this is because farmers have been experiencing extreme droughts in parts of Central America. And so this drives farmers to the cities and then eventually north to start looking for jobs in the US. We also have indigenous communities that are drawing from farming practices that have sustained them for literally hundreds of years, who are now suddenly losing their harvest 3 or 4 years in a row. And they just have not seen that before. And so not only does that lead to migration, but it's really disintegrating entire communities who are being forced to migrate either internally within the country or to leave the country to find work. So we see how climate change is really disproportionately affecting people who are already vulnerable and marginalized. We see this with communities and individuals who have fewer resources, indigenous communities, and in the US, especially with communities of color who are disproportionately affected by pollution, as well as things like severe storms. And so that's definitely something that we want to respond to and that MCC wants to give priority to in our work. But also we care about climate change simply because we love people and we love God's good creation. I'm sure that's what draws many of you to care about climate change as well. We want to see a world in right relationship with God, one another, and creation. So how does MCC respond to climate change? We support a lot of local efforts around the world to help communities adapt to all these increased droughts and flooding. We also support partners in providing training in what we call soil and water conservation techniques. We try to help people find different ways of making income if they can't farm anymore. We help migrants on their journey and in their new countries, and including those where climate change has been a factor in their deciding to move. And then our peace building work also helps communities where climate change might be a factor in conflict, where there could be things like groups that are competing for scarce resources, or this could be land or clean water. And then we also provide a lot of humanitarian aid, trying to provide emergency food and resources when communities are hit by huge tropical storms that have gotten worse with global warming. And then we look at climate change, though, also as a very systemic issue. And we advocate to the US and Canadian governments for policies to address climate change and to help communities who have been impacted by climate change. So a short list of our advocacy priorities. We focus on foreign assistance. So this would be US funding to help communities around the world. We also look at the intersections of climate change with other issues like I've been talking about here with food security and migration, health, conflict. We try to give priority for vulnerable and marginalized communities in this conversation, and I'll go into that a little bit more, as well as looking at the racial justice and equity implications of policies to address climate change. And then we really try to do this all by sharing stories, relating the statistics to the individual stories of how people are being impacted and letting people tell their own stories. We don't do this work alone. We work in partnership around the world, but also in Washington, D.C. We work with a lot of other partners. I mentioned the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions, also Creation Justice Ministries, the Energy and Ecology Working Group, Interaction on a lot of our international work. And then we are sponsors of Ecumenical Advocacy Days, which just had a wonderful virtual conference on the topic of climate change. So let me move and talk a little bit about U.S. federal policies on climate change and some opportunities for you to advocate. You probably know that we've entered a new day here in 2021 in terms of having a president and an administration and a Congress that is actually receptive to taking actions to respond to climate change. So there is definitely reason to be encouraged and hopeful that we can get some good policies through to respond in a helpful way. But there's still a lot of work for advocates to do to help push for good policies, especially in Congress. I want to talk just for a minute about some of the policies that the Biden administration has already put in place, or at least taken steps toward. They have started the process for getting the U.S. back into the Paris Agreement. They also, just a few weeks ago, announced a new nationally determined contribution. And this is a commitment that countries make under the Paris Agreement to commit to how much they're going to lower their emissions by. And so they have set a goal of 50% below 2005 CO2 levels by the year 2030. And then a longer term goal would be to have net zero emissions by the year 2050. So that's a fairly ambitious goal, and it's going to take a lot to get there. They have also committed, this is for next year's budget, the fiscal 2022 budget, to put in $2.5 billion for climate finance. And that includes a little over $1 billion for the Green Climate Fund. And I'll talk more about the Green Climate Fund in a few minutes. You might have also heard about the infrastructure bill that the White House is pushing forward called the American Jobs Plan. And that does have a lot of clean energy provisions, clean transportation, grid modernization, and other things to respond to climate change. So that is definitely something to keep an eye on. And then in terms of what Congress is doing, Congress, if you know, works in 2-year increments. So any legislation that was introduced in the last Congress has to be reintroduced this year. So we're starting to see a lot of bills right now that are just being reintroduced in this new Congress. And these 2 bills are ones that MCC supported in the last Congress. And we're currently looking at the new versions to see if we can support them again. The first one is the Thrive Act. And that is a bill that focuses on climate change, but also with a racial justice focus and also with a labor protection focus. Then there's the Reclaim Act. I don't know if you've ever heard the term just transition, but it refers to looking at what's going to happen to all the workers in the fossil fuel industry, coal miners and oil and gas workers, and making sure that as we transition to more renewable sources of energy, that we're not simply pulling the rug out from under them. So it would provide for things like job training and economic investments in communities, especially in the Appalachia region, for instance. And the Reclaim Act is, I believe it's bipartisan in the Senate. I'm not sure about the House. And then the Thrive Act, though, is all Democrats. And then we will likely see a number of carbon pricing bills introduced. If you're not familiar with carbon pricing, you might have heard terms like carbon tax or cap and trade, carbon markets. Citizens Climate Lobby supports a lot of these bills. And what they do is they put a price on carbon. It's often in the form of a tax. And so things like gas for driving your car, your electric bill, if you get your electricity from fossil fuel sources, there would be a tax on that. And then that tax would be slowly raised to discourage people from using sources of energy that come from fossil fuels. And so this is often bipartisan legislation, and it's very attractive to legislators because it generates a lot of money, frankly. The idea is that some of this money would go back to consumers, especially low and middle income consumers, to try to offset the higher costs that they'd be paying for energy. But there still is usually a lot left over. And so legislators can put that towards tax breaks or other pet projects that they want to fund. So it can be just very popular and an interesting way to try and strike a compromise on the issue of climate change. But we have to ask if these proposals hold vulnerable groups harmless. One way we can do this is by paying attention to what Indigenous-led and Black-led and immigrant-led groups say. So I'd encourage you, if you're going to be doing any advocacy on carbon pricing bills, or if you're just curious what those bills are about, keep an eye on some of these groups like the Indigenous Environment Network, the Sunrise Movement, Hip Hop Caucus, Green Latinos, and see what they're saying about these proposals and how it would affect folks in their communities. So with MCC, we had created a resource with the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions to talk about carbon pricing. I can try to share that during the Q&A time. We also have created just kind of an internal set of questions to analyze carbon pricing bills, and I took just a few questions out of that. But some of the things we ask are, if there are direct payments to households, does this money reach the most vulnerable regardless of people's income and their work status or their citizenship? We also ask if the payments would account for differences in energy consumption between rural and urban households. And rural households, for instance, are going to use cars a lot more, so they're going to have a lot higher payments for gasoline than urban households. Also, is there funding to help rural communities and lower income households adapt to more renewable sources of energy, considering things like there's a higher use of home heating oil in rural communities, or that lower income households might have older vehicles and less efficient appliances. And so will there be efforts to help them adapt? And then also, will those households be able to adapt before the funding runs out? Because as the tax goes on after a number of years and people are transitioning to renewable energy, this brings less and less money in from the tax, and eventually the tax runs out, and the goal is that everybody will have transition. But if some lower income households haven't made that transition yet, they're still going to be paying very high electricity costs and gasoline costs. And then is there assistance for local governments for things like school buses, to switch those over to electric buses, police cars, fire trucks, especially smaller cities and counties who might not have as much financial resources to pull from. And then looking at some other new bills, these aren't bills that we have endorsed, but are just kind of watching. Of course, there's the Green New Deal. There's also this interesting bill called the Green New Deal for Public Housing, which combines a focus on climate change with public housing. There's the EJ for All, or Environmental Justice for All, Clean Future, and the Growing Climate Solutions Act. So we're going to at least try to put some links to information about these bills on our website. I'm not sure if we will be pushing any of them forward or not. Many of them are Democratic only, so it's not likely that they'll move forward, but elements of those bills might be included in other things that move forward. And then looking at more international focused legislation, one of the things we follow very closely is federal funding, or what we call the appropriations process, where funds are dedicated to things like the Green Climate Fund and other international climate finance programs that help communities overseas impacted by climate change. There's also an interesting bill called Women and Climate Change Act and the U.S. Climate Act. Again, these are mostly partisan bills except for the funding bills. And to say a little bit more about the Green Climate Fund, if you don't know what that is, it's a fund that more high wealth countries and high historically emitting countries, they contribute funds to. It came out of the Paris Agreement, or around the same time as the Paris Agreement. And the idea is to help vulnerable countries reduce their emissions, adapt to the effects of climate change, and really build resilience if they're in danger of being impacted by floods and droughts and storms, to try and build more resilience to that. And so some examples are climate resilient food security projects, clean cooking programs, restoration of ecosystems. They do a lot of good work around the world. And so the U.S. had pledged $3 billion to that fund back in 2015 when pledges were first starting. We only paid about $1 billion on that fund before the Trump administration came in and ended funding for the GCF. So we still owe $2 billion. And then by 2020, a lot of wealthy countries were already making their second pledges. So we need to catch up on what we owe and then commit some additional money to that fund as well. So that is something that we are already advocating on and will continue to advocate on, I'm sure. And I'll give an example of that in a minute. So I threw a lot of different policies at you, and you might be more familiar with some of those than I am if you're following these issues, but some of you might be asking, how can I keep up with all these issues, and how do I know what to advocate for and when? And the easiest way to do that is to sign up for action alerts at our website, and I'll put that in the chat at the end. And that's really easy to do, and we don't send out a whole lot of action alerts, usually not more than one a week, sometimes just a few a month. And yeah, it's just a really good way for you to know what's moving in Congress and what's important to advocate on without having to follow these things so closely on your own. And other groups have action alerts too. You might be signed up for some of those already, groups like Sierra Club, Interfaith Power and Light. They will also send out alerts like this. So just an example, if you're not familiar with our action alerts, if you go to our website, this is one that we have up right now for advocacy on the Green Climate Fund. And this is for sending letters to the House and the Senate. And this is what it looks like. You'll get a sample letter. You don't have to look up who your senators or representative is, because it's just all done automatically for you. And then there's a message body there, but you can change that. So you can create your own letter entirely, or you can use pieces of that and maybe add your own stories or reflections to the letter before you send it, or you can just send it as is if that's all you have time to do. We also let you know about things like National Interfaith Call-in days, when maybe there's a certain day where faith groups from all around the country are really pushing something forward, like the Green Climate Fund. And so when we do that, we give you the phone numbers to call and also some talking points. And if you just want to contact Congress, let's say you're really passionate about something that maybe MCC isn't supporting, maybe you want to talk about the Green New Deal, say, you can absolutely do that. Most members on their websites make it very easy to contact them. They have contact forms. You can also find phone numbers to call them. Handwritten letters, you might think that is super old-fashioned, but we keep hearing from congressional staff that handwritten letters actually get more attention than email, because they know that someone took the time to actually write it out and put it in the mail. So if you have time to do that, I would encourage you to do that. For all of these, though, be brief, try to be concise, because staffers don't have a lot of time to read emails or stay on the phone, and they will really appreciate if you make your points and maybe tell a short story and then let them get on to the next letter or phone call. But any way you can personalize your messages is really effective. This could be through stories that you've read or stories that you have lived experience in. For Congress, it's great if the stories are from their state or district. So if you have a story about a farmer in Pennsylvania affected, but also maybe you have a relative who was impacted by the California wildfires or something. And so just bringing those stories into the conversation can help move the conversation beyond the statistics and help them understand why you care about it so much. Also, if you're on Facebook or Twitter, most members of Congress are on social media and use it quite a bit, even Instagram. So you can engage with them that way. You can kind of just monitor their account, see what they're talking about, and respond to them. Also, let them know if they're doing things you like. Sometimes we only speak out when they're doing things we don't like, but it's also good to just send them a positive tweet if they voted a way that you're happy with. Letters to the editor are also a really good way to get your message out. And in your local paper, you're more likely to get something published in your local paper. And that's also what members of Congress read, because they want to see what their constituents are saying. And the best way to get a letter to the editor published is to respond to something quickly. So if a bill has just come out, or if your lawmaker has said something in the media about their position on the Green Climate Fund or something, you can respond to that within a day or two and send something to the newspaper. It's more likely to get published. Usually under 200 words is what they want to see for those letters too. And then if you would like to, and if you're brave enough, you can meet with your legislators in person, or it's actually even easier now because you can do virtual visits still in a lot of offices. You don't even have to leave your home to meet with your members of Congress, or at least with their staff. Some of them are doing video conferences, some of them are only doing phone calls, but it's a really great opportunity to do those kinds of visits now. I'm gonna skip ahead because if you're interested in setting up a visit, we have a whole fact sheet that talks about the steps to do that, and also just tips for having an effective visit with a lawmaker or with their staff. And this is in our How to Be an Advocate resources on our website. We also have a resource about a biblical basis for advocacy if you're interested in that. More tips for contacting members of Congress and using social media. And then if you really want to geek out on how a bill becomes a law, we have a whole resource explaining that process. And then as I'm winding up here, I wanted to say just a little bit about your specific legislators in Pennsylvania. I'm not sure if any of you might be in Representative Fitzpatrick's district or not, or if you might know folks in his district, but they are pretty receptive to talking about climate change. Fitzpatrick is on the Climate Solutions Caucus. And then Senator Toomey, who you might think would not be someone you'd want to talk with on this issue, is also on the Climate Solutions Caucus. And I keep hearing from folks that have talked with that office that the staffer who follows climate change, Hal Duncan, is very receptive to talking with individuals and groups on climate change. And they've had some really good meetings with that office. So I'd encourage you to think about that if you are thinking about doing meetings. And then engaging with local partners. At the MCC office, we only focus on federal issues, but there are groups like Pennsylvania Council of Churches and Interfaith Power and Light that are also focused on state and local issues. And I think IPL in Pennsylvania has a pretty active chapter. And so they'll let you know about lobby days in the Capitol and anything that's moving at the state or local level. And then you are also welcome to reach out to MCC if you have specific questions about legislation. We can try to answer or point you to someone who can. We're happy to do advocacy trainings for churches. We can accompany folks, individuals or churches on congressional visits, especially if you're doing one for the first time. We're happy to do that. And it's so easy for us to do right now if we can do a virtual visit, because you don't have to come here to DC. I don't have to come to you. We can just all meet on Zoom. And we have done that with several groups and individuals already, and those have been very successful. And I'm also available to do sermons or give presentations like this in a Sunday school or a small group class, either more general like this, or if you wanted to talk about a specific topic within climate change, we can do that too. So I will leave it there. I will put, I'll put the website and my email address in the chat. And then maybe while I'm doing that, I will look through the questions in the chat, but if anyone has a live question you'd like to ask to get us started, we can do that.
I'll speak up here as the host, I guess, that if you want to speak, feel free and unmute yourself. And apologies, Tammy, apparently our house bandwidth is insufficient for Keith to give his lecture and me in this separate room to show my face. So that's why you can't see.
That's fine. All right, well, maybe I'll look through some of these comments and questions that have come through. So yeah, talking about citizens, climate lobby, carbon tax bills that they're supporting. I would still be, I don't know, have a healthy skepticism to carbon tax bills that CCL is supporting, and still see what some of those groups that represent people of color and other marginalized groups are saying about those specific bills. But I don't know, Dan, if you wanted to say anything more about carbon tax bills or not.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds a lot different than the way you described it. The carbon fees are collected from the generator of the carbon and not from the consumer. And the dividend is, with the exception of some small overhead costs, the dividend is entirely intended to go back to consumers. And it's going directly to consumers, and it's not based on income, so that actually in terms of their income, low income people are actually getting a disproportionately higher portion of the fee than what their costs are. So it's intended to provide some social justice, certainly through that mechanism, and at the same time to be completely free of a lot of government overhead and siphoning money off from this program to operate other federal funds, other federal programs. It's pretty cool, and I can tell you when you talk about how you talk to folks in your local congressman's office or congressperson's office, the CCL folks have got a very almost Mennonite-like approach to it. You always start with a thank you, which is sometimes kind of difficult with some of the fairly right people that we interact with, but they always encourage you to start with something. They always insist that people are respectful during their conversations, and you can be firm but not necessarily nasty. There's no reason to be nasty. So I don't know. I found it to be a pretty amazing group. Certainly, we have not had a lot of participation with indigenous groups, but we have had a lot of participation from people of color groups in New York State anyway.
Good. Yeah, and that's a good point that not all carbon tax bills are alike, certainly. There are some that funnel a lot of the revenue to things that have nothing to do with climate change, and then there are some like the one you're talking about that do try to keep it all going back to consumers. Even some of the more progressive bills, though, some of the work that our energy and ecology working group have done, we've been talking with a lot of different groups, and just sometimes the devil is in the details on those bills too, and the ways that they get money to consumers and who can get left out of those schemes. And it can end up treating rural and urban consumers kind of unfairly if they're being treated the same when their energy costs can be very, very different. And so there's a lot of details still we would like to see being discussed. When lawmakers are having hearings on these types of bills, we just want to hear these questions being asked to make sure that they're being thought of in the process. And so, sometimes it's just a good opportunity then when you're in an office, even if you're supporting these bills, to just say, hey, are you thinking about this and this and this as you're working on these carbon pricing bills? Because we really like this bill, but want to make sure that you're considering everyone. Oh, I think I have more here. That Pennsylvania is working through the carbon pool that New York and New England are already in. Yes, I've heard a little bit about that too. I don't know if anyone else here can say more about that, but those also, I think, have been producing some good results.
I've got a question. My name is Gretchen. I'm from Ambler Mennonite Church in Ambler, PA. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on how to do advocacy as a congregation versus as an individual. we did an Earth Day project where we wrote cards of thanks to our representatives who are doing climate work. But we weren't sure how to sign them as individuals or as representing the church. And like when we make those visits, how does that work? We're coming as individuals or we're coming representing our congregation, I guess is.
Yeah, good question. And that does get very tricky. And I think my recommendation tends to be that unless you've really had some conversations together as a congregation and have some have some official things that have come out of the congregation supporting certain policies. Usually what I've seen when churches go in to do advocacy is they'll say, yes, we're all from Bethesda United Methodist Church or something, but not necessarily representing. I mean, we're all members of this church, but not necessarily representing the church position as you're going in there, but representing yourself as individuals and people who care about the issue. Kind of, if that's helpful. Was someone else going to add to that too? No. Okay. Yeah, because it just, especially if you're worried that there might be different opinions within the church, I think it's best to be clear about that. Yeah.
I should think you can put your name and the church you belong to without saying this is my church's opinion, and you can say things like our Sunday school class,
right?
So that you can make it clear that there is a group, but in particular, make clear that you have faith and that it matters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So yeah, I think it is good to identify what church you belong to. So you're identifying yourself as a person of faith and maybe of a particular faith. And then, yeah, but not making it sound like you're representing the official position of the church if you're not.
But would it be more effective if we were to get everybody on board with some resolution or whatever to go in and say, I represent this number of people? That's what I've always been taught in advocacy, is you go in saying that, it helps them to know that there's numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. If you can do that, absolutely. Yeah. If you can, I mean, even have your church council pass a statement or something that they could sign, then yeah. But at the same time, I think for something like a church, an individual church, if a congressional office sees 10 or 12 people coming in from that church, I think they're going to see that as pretty significant interest from that church and pretty representative of how that church feels about an issue. So I don't know if it's that important that it be an official statement, because they'll kind of assume that you represent the church anyway, even if you don't officially say that.
Okay, great. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, other questions or other experiences advocating or other bills that you're interested in?
Is there any talk of picking up the Clean Power Plan? Do you know?
I have not heard anything about that. My understanding was that the Biden administration was going to go in a different direction and not try to pick that up again. And I think perhaps some of the pieces of that will be included in the infrastructure bill and other proposals. But that was my understanding, that the Clean Power Plan was not going to be resurrected.
There's an awful lot of work went into that. That's too bad.
I know. So it's not clear to me yet how many pieces of that might be adopted in either in legislation or in other, kind of just individual policies that the Biden administration puts out. So I don't think all that work will be for naught. It just won't happen in that form.
For those of you who don't know, a consulting group that does energy stuff put together an active spreadsheet tool that you could say, all right, this is my state and these are the emitters, and reapportion or pay for the carbon So it amounted to a kind of cap and trade situation, but there's a tremendous amount of work on this single spreadsheet that would say, if I do X, then in the end, this is what will happen. And I had a bit of a role in it when I was in Kansas, just reviewing, not really doing anything else, but it was an impressive piece of work. The fact is, there's an awful lot of science out there done by the utility industry looking forward to this is what we're going to have to do. So the thinking is there amongst the industry people that need to do it.
Yeah, and depending on how you approach this issue, I mean, clean energy, for example, is something that is popular with Republicans in some state. I mean, you mentioned Kansas. I mean, Kansas gets a large percent of its electricity from renewable sources like wind, and that's a very Republican-controlled state right now. But they've seen economically that makes sense, and so we can't write off more conservative lawmakers, because there's usually some aspect of the things we want to do to address climate change that will appeal to almost anyone. It might only be one or two little things, but there's a lot more that folks can agree on than we think about sometimes. I mean, people see farmers, they see the farmers in their state. Iowa has been affected by flooding, California by the wildfires, of course, but I think just more and more as these effects are being seen and felt by people in red and blue and purple states, that we're going to have to talk about this one way or another.
Do you see young people, teenagers, young adults involved in the Mennonite work that you're doing? Yeah, I have teenagers, so I'm wondering what the intersection or who you partner with that I could refer them to do activism and so forth.
Yeah, that's a great question. Not as much at the high school and middle school level. We do have an essay contest, and we had a climate change question on there last year, not for this year's contest. But with college students, I would say definitely yes. And a lot of that is through our collaboration with the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions, because they have some very strong programs at colleges like Goshen and EMU, but also pull in students, especially Anabaptist students from other colleges. They have internship programs, and we have a summer intern every year placed in our office through that program, who's working on issues related to climate change. They also have one-year fellowships, and we have a fellow in our office right now, Clara Waybright, who's working on climate change. And they have other internships. They have like a communications internship. I forget what else, but yeah, they definitely have a focus on college age and recent college graduate aged young adults, and have some really good programs.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I should also say that just a lot of the partners that we work with here in Washington, D.C. too, groups like Church World Service, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, IPL, they also host college interns here all through the year often. And so if someone's looking for an internship, if someone writes me, I'll often just try to give them a whole list of organizations to look at, to apply to find an internship related to climate change. Has anyone else done advocacy on climate change at the state or federal level, or are there any particular bills you're watching? Has anyone worked with the Pennsylvania Council of Churches or the Pennsylvania chapter of Interfaith Power and Light at all?
I've been getting the IPL letters and stuff. Pennsylvania does seem to be much more organized than Kansas IPL was, which is kind of cool. They are wanting to plant trees just like Mennonite men are wanting to plant trees. So I have trees coming eventually, a couple weeks, I think, from Lewisburg. And they have a bike ride scheduled coming up soon for fundraising. If you get sponsors and or pay, I think they were going to do it in pieces. They've divided the state up so that not everybody starts at one place. Some very active folks. One of the things that IPL has been doing that this year because of COVID is incoming like quarterly worship things, not real long, maybe half an hour, but just to remind us how good creation is and to rejoice together, which is, it's uplifting for me. It's the hope in the middle of the growling. So.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks, Ruth. And you were breaking up a little bit talking about the bike ride, but I think we caught enough of it. I should have mentioned too that the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions is also doing a climate ride. I believe it starts at the end of this month and goes to July. I don't think it's coming through Pennsylvania though, because I got them to end up here in Washington, D.C. so they could do some advocacy in July when they're here. But I think they'll have some interesting events that will be online with that too.
Steve, do you want to talk about what Mennonite Men has been up to?
I don't know much about that. It sounds like you know more than I do, Ruth.
Well, it doesn't fall under our topic of advocacy, but more on the planting side as a way of sequestering carbon. So it's a campaign to plant 1 million trees, primarily working with our Mennonite congregations, property owners. And so we have projects throughout the states, and we're working with the Mennonite Mission Network, looking for partner organizations with MCC, anyone who wants to partner with Mennonite Men for our campaign called Join Trees.
Great, great. Yeah, and there are policies that focus more on in that vein. I'm trying to find the one bill. Oh, the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which is bipartisan. I think Senator Braun from Indiana is one of the folks leading that one up. And that's, yeah, looking at carbon sequestration, but through farms and using land. So yeah, those can be really good bipartisan solutions.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was going to say, I know this can be overwhelming because I talked about a lot of different policies, and I know folks don't have a lot of time often to do advocacy. So I think what's most effective, if you find something you're passionate about, like carbon pricing bills, like Dan, or something like carbon sequestration through trees or farming. I think it's great to be able to focus in on one or two things and learn more about those topics, and then you'll be a much more effective advocate that way too. All right, well, I guess we can let folks go a little early if there aren't any more questions. But do feel free to reach out by email if you have advocacy questions in the coming years.
Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you very much, Tammy.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Is there closing?
There is nothing formal.
Okay.
Suppose I can ask Tammy if you'd like to do a prayer or something.
Yeah, I'd be happy to close us in prayer. Thanks for asking. Dear God, lead us through these conversations in this conference over the next day, and just also in the coming years as we really grapple with how to love your people and love your wondrous creation, and how we can be responsible citizens of this world and just really live in peace with others and with creation. Give us wisdom, give us patience, and give us grace to give to others, and as we work toward real solutions. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Thank you all.
See you all tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Bye.
Can you hang on a second, Tammy?